Hello, again, Sami Abdel Noor. Our current subject is non-Arabs who were Islamized between quotations during the Arab conquests, beginning with the Turks. Now why have I chosen this subject? It's very important. What exactly the effects of Turks and Persians was upon Arab culture is not easily understood because it's all lumped under the name Islam. And that's wrong. First of all, you have to know what Arab culture is, and that's not easy to teach, especially to non-Arabs. So, it will come along gradually. Last time we spoke of when the Arabs were first introduced to Turks. It's relatively recent as far as the length of Arab history, which is very ancient. They were introduced to Turks after the conquest of Iran, of Persia, after the Arab conquests of the Iranians, because the Iranians were always in contact with Turks. So after the Arab conquest of Persia, the Arabs were introduced to the Turks from northeastern Persia, an area called Khurasan in Iran. Now, the Turks had a practice, part of their culture was when they needed money, they sell their children. And it still exists. This practice can still be found in the areas of extending from northeast Iran all the way to China. They still do that, and this is completely new to Arabs. Arabs do not do that, and it is disdained from an Arab perspective. So how did it affect the Arabs of the time? They began buying these slave boys, these small, young slave boys. Again, to reiterate. Around the year 750 AD, there was a huge shift, a change in the Arab Islamic polity. The state was completely replaced. One state replaced another. Army from Khurasan, northeastern Iran, led by Arabs, named the Abbasids, took over power. But the mainstay of the army, the backbone of it, was Persian, Iranian. And as we said before, it was a practice in Iran to have a slave army, an army made of homosexual slave boys originally, and young men. So a small contingent of Turks was already in the Abbasid army, and it stood at that at the beginning. But as the Abbasid Caliphate grew older, they would buy these slave boys from the markets, use them in the caliphal palaces. Now this reached such an extent that they became in the thousands, and they had a name in Arabic. They were called ghulam. Now this name ghulam, it's still used in Iran and among the Turks. Arabs don't use it. It's an Arabic word, and it came to mean, in the Abbasid era, a slave boy, a concubine, a male concubine, a homosexual male concubine. That's what it came to mean. So we don't use that name, but Turks and Persians still use it. They call themselves ghulam. Now, they became in the thousands in the Abbasid courts, and to such an extent that it became the fashion for everyone to admire the beauty of homosexual relations with these ghulams, these concubine slave boys, Turkish slave boys, mainly Turkish. And to such an extent that even slave girls had to emulate slave boys. They had to cut their hair short and wear boys' clothes, the clothes that the caliph and the entourage of the caliph would bestow upon these slave boys. They would make them dress sort of like in women's clothing, but they still looked like boys in women's clothing. Slave girls that emulated slave boys were called, the boy is ghulam, the girl is ghulamiya, who's acting like a ghulam, a concubine, homosexual Turkish slave boy. So there is much description of these Turkish slave boys and their homosexual relations, both in Persian and Arabic literature of the time. We spoke of that earlier and the difference between the two literatures. For anyone interested, there's a lot. And it became the mainstay of the caliphal institution, to such an extent that within the courts, almost everything would have to pass through a Turkish homosexual slave boy to reach the caliph. Any matter. However, remember, the mainstay of the army at the time and the bureaucracy was Iranian, Persian. The figurehead of the state was Arab, always was. But the state became Persian. This reached such an extent that the caliphs began wanting to counterweight the Persians with Turks to curb Iranian influence within the state. And where do they get the Turks from? From the slave markets. They already had thousands of homosexual Turkish slave boys. What was the practice? Before the Arabs, between Turks and Iranians, they would make a homosexual slave army out of them. So that's what they did. This occurred around the year 830 AD. So now these Turkish slave boys were being transformed into an army, and that had a process. It had a specific set of rules that had to apply. First of all, these people were Islamized between quotations, so they declare their Islam. Theoretically, you cannot enslave him after that, but he is already your homosexual concubine, so there is no danger of loyalty as far as the caliphal institution sees it. So they built them a city, especially for them, and they started buying Turkish slave girls for them to procreate in that city because the populace hated them. The Arab people of Baghdad at the time despised them, they hated them very much. And the caliph had to build them their own city. It began with the city of Samurra, which still exists. He took all the slave boys over there, he made them into an army, and started buying them women to procreate. Now this institution of Turkish homosexual slave boys, as I said, it was not limited to any age. It continued throughout life. So a soldier, even within the literatures, particularly Persian literature on the subject, would be a soldier in the day, and then his master, his former master, would have intercourse with him at night. He would take off the armor when there's no war, and he would remain a concubine. So as I said, this began to counterweight Persian influence, but now the Turks were gaining influence at the expense of the Persians, and they began controlling the caliph himself. Nothing, as I said, could reach the caliph except through them. They became, of course, his guard, and if he didn't do what they wanted, they would kill him, and they would torture him. And from the year 830 onwards, it is very rare that any Arab caliph was not at least tortured by his former Turkish homosexual slaves. Among their torture was popping out his eyes, dragging him until he died, burying him alive. Anything you can imagine, they've done to the caliphs. And the caliphs were between a rock and a hard place. Between, you have these Turkish slave boys who control everything, and you have Iranians on the other end. At the other end, then the question here poses itself: what was this state that conquered all these areas from the whole center of the world, from China to France? Not the Turkish slave boys. This was the original Arab army that was eradicated when the Abbasids took over, from coming with their army from Khorasan. So the question poses itself: what was the original Arab Islamic state? What was its structure? How does it... It's not this one. and I will tell you what it originally was in the coming discussion. Salam.